Emily had always imagined her life as perfect. A loving family, a promising career, and the man of her dreams by her side. Her mother, Margaret, seemed supportive, offering advice with a gentle smile. But behind those words lurked something darker, a quiet, controlling influence Emily hadn't yet noticed. As she prepares for the happiest chapter of her life, a subtle unease begins to creep in. Could the very person she trusts most become the reason for her heartbreak? Before we dive into today's tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a story. Emily's life seemed perfect, but small cracks were beginning to appear. At first, they were subtle, barely noticeable comments that she brushed off as harmless advice. "Are you sure Daniel is right for you?" Margaret would ask casually, tilting her head with that practiced, concerned smile. "I just worry. You know how young men can be. Sometimes they say one thing and mean another." Emily laughed it off at first, believing her mother was just being cautious. But the little comments continued. At dinner, Margaret would casually mention Daniel's friends, highlighting minor flaws or imaginary mistakes. "I heard one of his friends had some trouble at work. You should be careful around them," she said, voice syrupy sweet, yet carrying an unspoken weight. Emily tried to shrug it off, but a tiny seed of doubt had been planted. She began to notice moments when Daniel's enthusiasm for a project or a family event was met with subtle skepticism. Suddenly, she found herself questioning whether she had been too naive about him. Even in private conversations, Margaret found ways to manipulate. When Emily would gush about Daniel's small acts of kindness, Margaret would respond with a sigh or a sharp, dismissive comment. "That's nice, dear, but don't let him fool you. Some men act good at first. It doesn't last." Emily felt a flicker of unease. She tried to push it away, telling herself her mother was just trying to protect her. But the repetition of these statements began to erode her confidence. Outside the home, Margaret's influence extended in subtler ways. She would call friends of Emily's and subtly question Daniel's character, planting doubts that spread like invisible poison. Emily noticed some friends became hesitant when speaking of her fiancé. When she asked them, they would shrug, offering vague warnings or excuses. Emily felt increasingly isolated, not because Daniel was unworthy, but because her mother's words had started shaping perceptions around her. Even Daniel noticed the tension. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, he asked softly, "Emily, is something bothering you? You've been distracted lately." She tried to smile, but her mind had been clouded by Margaret's persistent remarks. "It's nothing," she said, brushing it off, though the words tasted hollow. She didn't realize that Margaret's manipulation was not just casual concern, it was deliberate. Every comment, every raised eyebrow, and every whispered warning was a calculated move to destabilize her trust in Daniel, and ultimately her own judgment. Despite the growing unease, Emily still clung to the belief that her mother loved her. She reminded herself of all the sacrifices Margaret had made, of all the guidance she had received. But an invisible tension lingered in the air, a subtle but constant tug at her heart. Little did Emily know that this was only the beginning. The gentle warnings, the cautious advice, and the subtle manipulations were laying the groundwork for something much darker. A part of her wondered why she felt so unsettled. A fleeting thought would cross her mind. Why does it feel like I'm always second-guessing myself around her? She pushed it away, yet the nagging feeling never fully disappeared. Margaret had mastered the art of control through subtlety, planting seeds of doubt that would grow into thorns, ready to pierce the very foundation of Emily's happiness. By the time Emily finally confided in Daniel about some of her mother's comments, she already felt trapped in a maze of uncertainty. Margaret's shadow was everywhere over dinners, conversations, even in the quiet moments of the night when Emily thought she was alone. The first signs of manipulation had appeared like soft whispers. but they were shaping the storm that was about to engulf her life. Despite the subtle tension creeping into her life, Emily tried to focus on the bright side, Daniel. Their love had been effortless from the start, a connection that felt rare and unshakable. Even with Margaret's lingering doubts, Emily and Daniel found joy in each other's company. Weekends were spent exploring the town, laughing over coffee in small cafes, and planning their future together. Every shared glance, every tender touch reminded Emily that she had chosen wisely, or so she thought. Daniel was everything Emily had ever dreamed of. He was supportive, patient, and deeply attentive. When she shared her aspirations for a career in design, he encouraged her to chase them without hesitation. He would stay up late, helping her brainstorm ideas for projects, or sit quietly as she pored over sketches, offering a hand when she needed guidance. With him, Emily felt understood, appreciated, and seen. For the first time, she believed in a life full of love and fulfillment. Yet, even in these moments of happiness, Margaret's shadow loomed. She seemed cordial on the surface, attending brunches and small gatherings with an air of sweetness, but Emily began noticing subtle signs of envy. Margaret's compliments felt measured, her smiles just slightly forced. When Emily excitedly mentioned an idea Daniel had proposed for a home renovation, Margaret would interject with quiet criticism. "It's a nice idea, dear, but Daniel isn't really experienced with projects like that. I just worry." Emily tried to brush it off, but the hesitation in her mother's voice gnawed at her confidence. Margaret's envy grew more obvious during social gatherings. When friends admired Emily's engagement ring or praised Daniel's achievements, Margaret would offer faint smiles, but her eyes betrayed a twinge of irritation. She asked unnecessary questions about Daniel's job, subtly hinting at insecurities that weren't there. Emily noticed, yet dismissed it as typical parental concern. After all, everyone wanted her happiness, didn't they? Still, the tension was palpable. Daniel occasionally noticed the awkwardness. Once, at a small dinner party, Margaret mentioned a distant cousin of Daniel's who had made a few bad choices, implying that Daniel might share similar traits. Emily forced a laugh, uncomfortable, while Daniel's brow furrowed. Though he brushed it off, Emily couldn't shake the creeping unease that perhaps her mother wasn't as supportive as she claimed despite the unease. Love continued to flourish between Emily and Daniel. They celebrated small victories, landing a new apartment, planning a future wedding, and meeting each other's friends and families. Emily cherished these moments deeply, clinging to the certainty of her love, while unknowingly walking into a web of manipulation. Margaret, always present but never overt, watched closely, waiting for a moment when her influence could strike hardest in the quiet of her apartment. Emily often reflected on her life with Daniel. She felt gratitude, joy, and hope. "This is how life should feel," she would whisper, leaning against Daniel as he held her close. But underneath her contentment, a subtle unease lingered, an instinctive warning she could not yet name. The love between Emily and Daniel was real, but Margaret's envy was growing, a silent predator circling its prey, ready to pounce at the perfect moment. Every laugh shared, every whispered promise, every quiet moment of intimacy was now under the shadow of an invisible threat. Emily remained blissfully unaware that the happiness she cherished was exactly what her mother intended to destroy. Emily's days, once filled with laughter and warmth, began to feel clouded by unease. It started with small incidents that seemed coincidental. At first, Daniel arriving late to dinner, a missed phone call, a forgotten errand. Margaret's influence, once subtle and almost invisible, began to push the couple into moments of tension. She had perfected the art of interference, disguising manipulation as concern, planting doubts that festered quietly until they threatened to boil over. One evening, as Emily and Daniel discussed plans for their upcoming engagement party, Margaret appeared with an expression of casual worry. "I don't know, Emily. Are you sure Daniel's friends are trustworthy? I heard some unsettling stories. Maybe you should rethink the guest list. Her voice was soft, almost soothing, yet it carried an unmistakable weight. Emily paused, her mind suddenly racing with questions she hadn't considered. Daniel tried to reassure her, but a faint shadow of doubt had already taken root. Margaret's tactics became increasingly deliberate. She would leave articles or messages on Emily's phone, subtle insinuations about Daniel's supposed unreliability or his friend's questionable behavior. She'd call with half-truths, conveniently timed to spark arguments. Once, during a casual brunch, she remarked, "I hope Daniel isn't planning anything too risky with that new business idea. Some men don't think ahead, you know." Emily felt the warmth of excitement drain from her chest, replaced by a quiet apprehension. Even small interactions at home were not spared. Margaret would comment on Daniel's habits, painting ordinary quirks as red flags. "He always leaves the dishes in the sink. Does that not worry you? It's just a glimpse of how careless he might be later in life." Emily tried to argue, tried to remind herself that these were trivial things, but the subtle repetition began to erode her confidence. Every observation, every question, became a seed of mistrust, growing slowly. INVISIBLY. The tension spilled into conversations with friends and family. Margaret would casually warn Emily about Daniel to anyone who would listen, creating doubt not only in Emily's mind, but also in the perceptions of those around her. Friends started questioning Daniel's intentions, offering vague warnings, unsure if they had seen something themselves or were influenced by Margaret's subtle manipulations. Emily noticed the shift and felt an increasing isolation, though she still struggled to identify the cause. Daniel sensed the growing strain and tried to address it gently. "Emily, you've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" he asked one evening, his eyes searching hers. She hesitated, unsure how to voice the creeping dread she felt, unsure how to explain that the unease wasn't truly about him, but about her mother's insidious influence. I don't know," Emily admitted quietly. "I just feel like something's off." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, yet they were a faint acknowledgment of the truth she couldn't fully see. Margaret, meanwhile, observed from the sidelines, always poised, always calm. Her smile never faltered, but inside she relished the subtle discord she had sown. Every disagreement, every fleeting doubt in Emily's mind was a victory for her carefully orchestrated plan. The mother who had once been a source of guidance and comfort had now become a silent instigator of conflict. By now, Emily's once steady trust in Daniel had begun to waver. Moments that were once effortless now felt heavy, loaded with suspicion she couldn't explain. Every glance, every word, every gesture was filtered through a haze of doubt planted by Margaret. The happy life she had envisioned with Daniel was slowly being overshadowed by tension and uncertainty, tension created by the very person who should have protected her. The stage was set. Margaret's interference had grown beyond whispers into a tangible force, threatening the foundation of Emily and Daniel's love. The first real cracks in their relationship were forming, and Emily, innocent and trusting, remained unaware that these fissures were not natural. They were manufactured, deliberately and mercilessly, by the mother she loved. For years, Emily had believed her mother's advice came from love, a desire to protect her from the harshness of the world. But as the months passed, the truth began to surface, subtle yet undeniable. Margaret's concern was not just a protective instinct, it was envy disguised as care. A gnawing realization slowly crept into Emily's mind. Her mother's actions were not for her benefit, but to satisfy Margaret's unspoken desires. Got it started with a casual conversation overheard between Margaret and a distant relative. Emily had come home early from a friend's gathering and paused at the doorway, thinking she would give her mother privacy. But the words she heard sent a chill down her spine. Margaret spoke in a low, controlled voice, one Emily had never heard before. "She has everything I never had. Her youth, her beauty, her happiness. I won't let her have it all. I'll make sure she learns to depend on me." Emily's stomach tightened. She had suspected manipulation before, but hearing the truth, the raw, unmasked truth, was a different kind of betrayal. Margaret's envy wasn't subtle anymore. It was calculated, strategic, and dangerous. Every word of caution, every carefully timed comment, every whispered warning about Daniel and her friends had been crafted with a single purpose: to destabilize Emily's life. The realization forced Emily to reflect on their entire relationship. She remembered the countless instances when Margaret had subtly undermined her confidence. Praise was always laced with criticism. Compliments were carefully measured to keep Emily unsure of herself. Even in moments of joy, Margaret's eyes carried a shadow, an almost imperceptible flicker of dissatisfaction that Emily had never noticed, or perhaps never wanted to see. Margaret's motives went beyond mere jealousy. She craved control. Emily's independence, her engagement, her plans for a future, all of it threatened Margaret's sense of dominance. She had long since given up on her own dreams, and watching Emily thrive sparked a cold, calculated resolve. To Margaret, Emily's happiness was not something to celebrate. It was a challenge to overcome, a puzzle to manipulate, a life to control. Emily thought back to the small incidents she had dismissed, the comments about Daniel's friends, the late-night warnings, the casual insinuations that made her doubt her own judgment. Every one of them now fit into a clear pattern. Margaret's subtle manipulations were pieces of a larger, deliberate plan, a blueprint to ensure that Emily would remain dependent, uncertain, and eventually heartbroken. The emotional weight of the revelation pressed down on Emily. She felt a mixture of anger, disbelief, and sorrow. How could the person she had loved and trusted so completely harbor such darkness? How could a mother someone meant to protect, nurture, and guide be the architect of her potential misery? Each question pounded in her mind like a relentless drumbeat. But amid the turmoil, a flicker of determination emerged. Understanding Margaret's motives was painful, but it also brought clarity. Emily realized she needed to see the full scope of the manipulation, to trace the path Margaret had laid before her. Knowledge, she understood, was her first step toward reclaiming control of her own life. Margaret, oblivious to Emily's growing awareness, continued her facade. She smiled warmly, offered advice with the same polished, caring tone, and watched as Emily's doubts deepened. The mother who had seemed a pillar of support had been revealed as the very force undermining the foundation of her daughter's happiness. The veil of innocence was lifted, and the true stakes of Emily's life, the very real danger posed by her mother, became undeniable. The game had shifted. What had begun as subtle whispers and cautious warnings had now transformed into a calculated strategy. Margaret's envy was no longer hidden. It was a weapon, and Emily, standing on the edge of realization, knew she was facing the full force of her mother's manipulative intent. The question lingered, heavy and inescapable. How far would Margaret go to ensure that Emily's happiness would be hers to control or destroy? The tension that had been building for months reached its breaking point one rainy evening. Emily and Daniel sat in the living room of their new apartment, discussing final details for their engagement party. Everything should have felt joyous, celebratory, yet an unshakable weight hung between them. Margaret had been careful for months, planting doubts, whispering half-truths, and weaving her web of subtle manipulation. Tonight, she planned her most devastating move yet. A message appeared on Emily's phone, a carefully crafted note, seemingly from one of Daniel's closest friends. It described, in vivid detail, Daniel's supposed financial irresponsibility and implied romantic indiscretions. The sender's name was masked, but the content was convincing enough to send a chill down Emily's spine. Her hands trembled as she read it, heart sinking. It felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. Daniel. She stammered, voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted toward him, searching for answers, for reassurance, for the warmth she had come to trust. Daniel noticed her pale face and the trembling in her hands. "Emily, what's wrong?" he asked gently, concern etched into every line of his face. She handed him the phone, unable to form the words. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel scrolled through the message, confusion darkening his expression. "Emily, I didn't do any of this," he said softly. "Someone must have sent this as a joke or a misunderstanding. You know me. Do you really believe this?" But doubt had already taken root in Emily's mind. Margaret's warnings, her subtle insinuations, all the whispers from months past, they suddenly made sense in a terrifying, undeniable pattern. The seeds she had planted had grown into full-blown mistrust. That night, arguments erupted. Words were sharp, hearts wounded, trust fractured. Emily, desperate and confused, could not see beyond the haze of fear that Margaret had created. Daniel tried to explain, to prove his loyalty and integrity, but the emotional damage was already done. Emily's tears fell freely, mingling with frustration and heartbreak. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. The words felt like nails driven into her own happiness. Meanwhile, Margaret watched from a distance, concealed behind a polite smile, maintaining the facade of concern. "I told you so," she thought quietly, savoring the turmoil she had orchestrated. Each tear, each trembling breath, was a testament to her carefully constructed manipulation. She had succeeded in destabilizing the one thing Emily cherished most. By the following week, the engagement had collapsed. Friends whispered, offering sympathetic glances, while Emily struggled to reconcile her love for Daniel with the gnawing suspicion that had been forced into her heart. Every joyful memory now felt tainted, shadowed by Margaret's influence. The life Emily had envisioned, the life she had worked toward with Daniel, was slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. Emily confronted Margaret, seeking answers, seeking truth. "Why would you do this?" she demanded, voice trembling yet filled with a rising fire. Margaret's eyes, polished and composed, met her daughter's with feigned innocence. "I only wanted to protect you, dear. I warned you. I cared about you," she said softly, her tone dripping with manipulative sweetness. But Emily had begun to see through the veneer. She recognized the calculated cruelty behind the carefully chosen words, the subtle control masked as maternal concern. For Emily, the betrayal was not only in the collapse of her engagement, it was in the realization that the person she had loved and trusted most had been orchestrating her heartbreak all along. Every warning, every doubt, every suggestion Margaret had planted over the years converged in this devastating moment, leaving Emily shattered and questioning her own judgment. The betrayal cut deeper than heartbreak. It was a fracture in the very foundation of trust, a wound inflicted by the hands that were supposed to nurture and protect. Emily's tears flowed freely, but beneath them, a quiet determination began to rise. The mother who had ruined her happiness had revealed herself fully. And while the pain was unbearable, Emily knew that understanding the betrayal was the first step toward reclaiming her life. In the days following the engagement's collapse, Emily felt like a ghost in her own life. The world seemed quieter, the laughter of friends hollow, and the warmth she had shared with Daniel replaced by a gnawing emptiness. Yet amid the grief, a spark of clarity began to emerge. Something didn't add up. The series of coincidences, the carefully timed warnings, the stories she had heard from friends, everything began to form a pattern. Emily started retracing the months of tension, examining her mother's words and actions with a new lens. She remembered the late-night calls, The seemingly casual remarks about Daniel and his friends, the mysterious messages that had appeared at just the wrong moment. It was no longer random chance. It was deliberate, calculated, and frighteningly precise. The realization hit her with the force of a storm. Her mother had orchestrated everything. Determined to uncover the full truth, Emily began gathering evidence. She checked phone records, compared timestamps, and reached out to friends who had noticed Margaret's subtle interference. Slowly, the puzzle pieces came together. A friend revealed that Margaret had called them multiple times, hinting at Daniel's unreliability. Another friend mentioned overhearing Margaret speaking disparagingly about Daniel to relatives at a family gathering. Emily's heart ached as the pattern became undeniable. Her mother had been manipulating not just her, but everyone around her. Armed with this knowledge, Emily confronted Margaret one quiet evening. The air between them was thick with tension. Emily's voice was steady but sharp, every word carefully chosen. "I know what you've been doing," she said, placing a stack of printed messages, notes, and testimonies on the table. Margaret's polished smile faltered for the first time, her composure cracking ever so slightly. I only wanted to protect you," she whispered, almost pleading. "No, you wanted to control me," Emily shot back, her voice rising. "Every warning, every doubt you planted, every rumor you spread, it wasn't about protecting me. It was about ruining my happiness, because you couldn't stand to see me thrive." Tears streamed down Emily's face, but this time they were mixed with fury and resolve. She was no longer a victim. She was a woman facing the truth and refusing to let it destroy her completely. Margaret tried to justify her actions, twisting words into half-truths, attempting to maintain the facade of maternal concern. But Emily no longer wavered. She could see the envy, the jealousy, the deliberate cruelty that had been hidden behind years of smiles and advice. The mother who had been a source of comfort had revealed herself as the architect of her misery. The confrontation was both painful and liberating. Emily's voice shook at times, but clarity replaced confusion. She began to understand the depth of Margaret's manipulation, and with that understanding came a strange sense of power. The realization that the betrayal had a pattern, and that she could trace it, offered a way to reclaim control over her own life. In the days that followed, Emily made subtle yet firm changes. She limited contact with Margaret, seeking emotional distance to protect her own sanity. She reached out to friends she had once relied on, rebuilding trust and connections that had been strained by her mother's interference. Slowly, she began to reclaim a life that had been overshadowed by manipulation, realizing that happiness, though once stolen, could be rebuilt with care and intention. By facing the truth, Emily transformed her grief into insight. Margaret's schemes, as cruel and calculated as they were, had inadvertently given Emily the most powerful gift: clarity. The veil of deception had lifted, and for the first time in months, Emily could see the path forward, a path where her life, her choices, and her happiness belonged to no one but herself. After confronting her mother and seeing the full scope of the betrayal, Emily realized that reclaiming her life would not be easy. The wounds ran deep, and the sense of loss was overwhelming. Yet beneath the heartbreak, a quiet determination began to grow. She refused to let Margaret's manipulation define her future. Emily understood that healing was not a passive process. It required deliberate action, self-reflection, and the courage to rebuild. The first step was creating emotional distance. Emily limited her interactions with Margaret, no longer allowing the woman who had orchestrated her pain to control her thoughts, decisions, or emotions. Phone calls became short and necessary. Visits were limited, and boundaries were firmly established. Each moment spent away from Margaret's influence strengthened Emily's sense of autonomy, helping her rediscover a life that belonged solely to her. Emily also turned to the people who had truly supported her friends, who had been caught in the web of Margaret's subtle interference. Reconnecting with them reminded her of the trust, loyalty, and love that still existed in her life. She shared her experiences openly, not to seek pity, but to release the weight of secrecy that had been imposed by her mother's manipulation. These conversations offered validation and perspective, helping Emily rebuild her confidence in herself and her judgment. Work became another pillar of her recovery. Emily immersed herself in her design career, channeling her emotions into creativity and achievement. Every project she completed, every deadline met, every praise received became a small victory, a tangible reminder of her strength and resilience. Where once her self-doubt had been magnified by Margaret's constant undermining, now it was replaced by pride in her own capabilities. She was learning to trust her instincts again, to rely on her own judgment without fear of manipulation. Slowly, Emily began to open her heart again, not necessarily to love, but to life itself. She took up hobbies she had abandoned, traveled to new places, and explored opportunities that she had once deferred. The process was gradual, punctuated by moments of lingering doubt, but with each small step, she reclaimed a piece of herself that had been overshadowed by her mother's control. Social gatherings, once stressful and colored by Margaret's influence, became opportunities for joy rather than anxiety. Emily allowed herself to laugh freely, to make plans, and to embrace spontaneity without fear of judgment or interference. The freedom was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the heavy, calculated control she had endured. Through this journey, Emily also reflected on the lessons learned. She recognized the importance of boundaries, of trusting her own instincts, and of confronting toxic influences before they could take root. Margaret's betrayal, while devastating, had forced Emily to grow stronger, wiser, and more self-reliant. Every day of recovery was a testament to her resilience and determination to build a life that could no longer be dictated by anyone else. By the time weeks had passed, Emily had transformed her grief into empowerment. The heartbreak still lingered, but it no longer defined her. She had reclaimed her agency, her voice, and her happiness. Margaret's influence had been diminished, no longer an invisible hand guiding Emily's choices. And as Emily looked forward, she understood that the life she was rebuilding was one forged by her own strength, unshaken by past betrayals. For the first time in months, Emily felt a sense of true liberation. Her life was hers alone, and while the scars of betrayal remained, they served as reminders of her resilience. The mother who had tried to control her happiness had inadvertently taught Emily the most important lesson of all, that true strength comes from within, and that happiness, once lost, can always be reclaimed. Months had passed since the storm of betrayal had upended Emily's life. The wounds inflicted by her mother, Margaret, still lingered, but they no longer held power over her. Each day brought a new opportunity to rebuild, to embrace independence, and to cherish the life she had fought to reclaim. In the quiet moments of reflection, Emily realized how far she had come, not just in recovering from heartbreak, but in understanding herself and the boundaries she needed to protect her happiness. Sitting by her window one morning, sunlight spilling across her apartment, Emily thought back to the chain of events that had brought her here. The subtle manipulations, the whispers of doubt, the orchestrated collapse of her engagement, it had all been designed to weaken her, to make her doubt her own judgment. And yet, she had survived. Not only survived, but emerged stronger, more self-aware, and fully in control of her life. Emily reflected on the relationship she had with Margaret, understanding it now with painful clarity. A mother's love is meant to nurture, to protect, and to support growth, but Margaret had used hers as a weapon, a tool to satisfy envy and maintain control. Recognizing this was a painful revelation, yet it was also liberating. She could no longer allow the shadows of the past to dictate her future. The betrayal had a name, a face, and a reason, and naming it allowed her to release its hold on her heart. The process of healing had been deliberate. Emily had rebuilt trust with friends, strengthened her career, and discovered joys that had been muted by fear and manipulation. She learned to celebrate her victories without apology, to pursue her passions without hesitation, and to live authentically without seeking permission. Each step forward was a small reclaiming of power, a quiet declaration that her life was her own dot in moments of solitude. Emily sometimes thought of Margaret. The woman who had once been a guiding figure had become a cautionary example of what happens when envy and control overshadow love. Emily felt no desire for reconciliation, only a clear understanding that the toxic influence had to be acknowledged, but not allowed to return. Boundaries were established and maintained, and with them came a sense of safety and freedom she had never known. Emily also reflected on the lessons she had learned about human nature, relationships, and self-reliance. She understood that betrayal can come from unexpected sources, that trust is fragile, and that true happiness requires vigilance, courage, and clarity. Yet she also understood that pain could be transformed into strength, and that heartbreak, while devastating, could become a catalyst for growth. As she looked toward the future, Emily felt a renewed sense of hope. Love, she realized, would not be defined by the past, but by her choices and the people who respected her boundaries and valued her trust. She envisioned a life filled with genuine connection, passion, and joy, one that was untainted by manipulation and grounded in authenticity. Final chapter of Emily's journey was not defined by betrayal, but by resilience. The mother who had tried to control her happiness had inadvertently taught Emily the most important lesson of all, that true strength and independence come from within. Happiness once stolen could always be reclaimed, and it would be all the more meaningful because it was chosen, nurtured, and protected by her own hands. Sitting quietly, Emily closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The storm had passed, and while the scars of the past remained, they served as reminders of her courage and growth. She was no longer a victim, no longer bound by manipulation or doubt. Her life was hers, authentic, unshakable, and full of the promise of happiness she had always deserved.